Hello, everyone, from the Eyewitness Newsroom. I'm Tom Abrams, along here with political consultant, longtime Houston political consultant Keir Murray, and we're going to break down what happened this past week in Miami with the two political debates. Thank you, Allison, our producer here, helping us in the newsroom work this newscast. We're going to break down what happened this last week in Miami and talk about what role Houston plays coming up, too, because we've got candidates here this weekend. Beto was here yesterday. Castro is here today. A bunch of candidates are coming in this week. Your first impressions from the debate?
Well, I mean, the challenge, of course, when you have 20 candidates, the 20 of whom who made the cut to actually be in the debate, is how do you stand out? You know, you've got some well-known names on the second night: Biden, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, a few folks like that, Elizabeth Warren on the first night, but probably half these candidates on either night, most voters had never even seen or heard of, much less know much about. So I think the challenge for these folks is to try to make some sort of an impression, hopefully a positive one, that sets them apart and sort of launches them to the next level of their campaign. To what extent they were able to do that, I'm not sure. It seemed to me that Elizabeth Warren, Julian Castro had strong breakout performances on the first night, and then most analysts think Kamala Harris was really the breakout winner of the second night in terms of establishing herself, setting herself apart, and the polling that's been done immediately afterward reflects that.
So let's talk about those breakout performances. First of all, Castro is someone who here in Texas we know because he was a San Antonio mayor, he was a HUD secretary under President Obama, but nationally has a very low profile, not much name recognition, gets mistaken for his twin brother, Joaquin, all the time.
The congressman. Yes.
Right, but there was an interesting exchange that I think would be good to share, and this is kind of the moment that everybody talks about where he engaged Beto O'Rourke, who has a much broader national exposure because of the Senate race, and they talked about immigration.
Texan on Texan political violence.
Exactly.
We would not build walls. We would not put kids in cages. In fact, we would spare no expense to reunite the families that have been separated already. And we would not criminally prosecute any family who is fleeing violence
for the repeal
and
of
persecution.
Section 1325.
We would make sure...
Secretary, let him finish, and I will give you this policy. But let him finish. Let him finish, please. Yes.
We would not detain any family fleeing violence, in fact, fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today. We would implement a family case management program so they could be cared for in the community at a fraction of the cost.
Let's be very clear. The reason that they're separating these little children from their families is that they're using Section 1325 of that act, which criminalizes coming across the border, to incarcerate the parents and then separate them. Some of us on this stage have called to end that section, to terminate it. Some, like Congressman O'Rourke, have not.
And we expect immigration to be one of the hot topics again. So there you saw me talking about it afterwards there from Miami. Your take on that, as we see Castro here at the Homestead facility where many of the candidates visited, where some undocumented teenagers are being detained.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting exchange. Of course, as we've seen, Beto O'Rourke had the breakout Senate race in 2018, very well known, very popular among Texas Democrats, either tied with Biden or leading in a lot of the polls in this early polls in this state, whereas you said Secretary Castro has sort of struggled to break out so far. So I think he was trying to take this opportunity on a very salient issue at the moment, given what's going on in these detention facilities, to try to distinguish himself from Congressman O'Rourke, land a punch that would set himself up in a way to move forward. To the extent that he did that, I'm not sure. As we know, former Secretary Castro was the first among the Democratic candidates to come out with a comprehensive immigration plan several months ago. The nature of the 1325 code and getting rid of it, decriminalizing illegal border crossings, how feasible that is as a matter of policy, I'm not sure. It was interesting to see the dynamic between him and O'Rourke on that regard. First time I've seen them be negative toward one another. I recall they were campaigning with each other a lot last fall.
So we talked to John Delaney, one of the candidates, a former congressman, about this afterwards, and he said, I can't believe they're sitting there talking about one section of the code. American people aren't going to pay attention to that. Is he right on that maybe some viewers got lost, or is the audience in this first debate, when you have so many people and we're so far out from Election Day, the people who really do care about policy to that degree?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's probably a little of both. I think Delaney's probably right that for the average member of the public, the particulars of the federal code related to immigration don't mean much. Candidly, I would say, where the American public is on this particular issue is complicated, right? Because
Sure.
I think most Americans are dismayed by seeing, children in deplorable conditions in some of these facilities, but at the same time, they may have strong feelings about wanting a secure border, and there's some in between there, right? So, but for purposes of the debate itself, I think likely your sort of hardcore partisans were mostly the audience actually watching the debate.
Sure.
So he probably scored some points. And again, my take is the specifics of the issue were probably less important than just finding a way for him to draw a contrast with another candidate, particularly a fellow Texan, and get himself some spotlight.
Because he needs it.
He does. He does. As you've said, he's been lagging in the polls. We haven't heard much about his fundraising numbers over the last few months. We'll know in a couple of weeks when these new reports come out. But I don't think fundraising has been going great for his campaign prior to this. And so this was probably an attempt in some ways to jumpstart that.
And by attacking a fellow Texan, he's also directing the attention of Texas donors who might have given to Beto or who might be waffling about who to give to.
Correct, and maybe some of whom are frustrated that Beto passed on a race against John Cornyn,
Sure.
where they might have liked to have seen him and instead is running for president.
And what did you think about Beto up on that stage? How did he fit with the other 9 candidates up there?
I mean, I thought he had some good moments during the debate, but in the case of both the exchange with Secretary Castro as well as New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, I thought he got pushed around a little bit on the stage, which is probably something you don't want. I know that he said after the debate that he thought he could do a better job of responding to attacks on him that he didn't think were accurate. So I would look for him in the next round to sort of sharpen his elbows a little bit if they come after him again.
Sure. Speaking of sharp elbows, on the second night, we saw Kamala Harris go after Vice President Joe Biden. Biden seemed to be, as the front runner, or perceived front runner, the target of a lot of attacks that night, but she may have landed the best punch, and we want to play that for you. This was an exchange over race.
I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of 2 United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, there was a little girl in California who was part of the 2nd class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me. So I will tell you that on this subject, it cannot be an intellectual debate among Democrats. We have to take it seriously. We have to act swiftly. As Attorney General of California, I was very proud to put in place a requirement that all my special agents would wear body cameras and keep those cameras on.
Mischaracterization of my position across the board. I did not praise racist. That is not true. Number one. Number two, if we want to have this campaign litigated on who supports civil rights and whether I did or not, I'm happy to do that. I was a public defender. I didn't become a prosecutor. I came out and I left a good law firm to become a public defender when in fact my city was in flames because of the assassination of Dr. King. Number one. Number two, as the Vice President of the United States, I work with a man who, in fact, we worked very hard to see to it we dealt with these issues in a major, major way. The fact is that in terms of busing, you would have been able to go to school the same exact way because it was a local decision made by your city council. That's fine. That's one of the things I argued for, that we should be breaking down these lines. But so the bottom line here is, look, everything I've done in my career, I ran because of civil rights. I continue to think we have to make fundamental changes in civil rights. And those civil rights, by the way, include not just only African Americans, but the LGBT community.
But Vice President Biden, do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No,
do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education That's what I oppose.
Well,
I
there
did
was
not
a
oppose.
failure of states to integrate
No,
public
but-
schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision.
So you could hear a pin drop not only in the hall that when that exchange happened, but in the media filing center.
Right.
And for members of the media to be quiet says something about that exchange. Your takeaway from that?
Well, a couple of things. I thought, Senator Harris, I thought set this up very well by praising the vice president, or maybe backhandedly. I don't think you're a racist, but saying something good or positive about him, but then following it up with a hit. And I thought in this instance, as well as in others, effective political communication is about telling stories, and she was able to do that several times during the debate and do that to her advantage. And the story that she told here, of course, ended up being about herself, which personalizes it in a way which I thought was very effective. How you view this exchange, however, I think might depend on the context of how old you are, right? Because I think perhaps not as crisply as he might have liked to, what Biden was trying to do was say, look at my record in context as a whole as a public service over the last 40, 50 years, right? The issues that they were discussing were taking place in the early 1970s, something like that, mid 1970s. Lots of voters weren't alive or adults at that point, I think us included. So if you're an older voter, though, you'll say, well, times were different back then. And overall, Joe's been okay on these issues. Again, I didn't think he made his point as crisply or as effectively as he might have, which I thought that was a problem for him throughout the debate. Showed his age a little bit, I thought, generally speaking. But it was a fascinating exchange, and I thought it was also interesting that the moderators let it go. They didn't try to stop it.
They did not interrupt. And I also thought, kind of maybe lost in there a little bit, is that you're talking about a political philosophy that has nothing really to do with race, and that is local control of schools. There's a huge political difference between the fact that there is a Department of Education and federal control of schools at all, where some people believe that the federal government should have nothing to do with schools.
Right.
And I think his point was we shouldn't be involved in local decisions, and her point was, well, in something like that you should.
Yeah, and you can see that point either way. I mean, she would probably, her retort to that would be, but yeah, morally this was the right thing to do. Why weren't you for it? And so it was, again, I think for her it was a fascinating moment and what was overall a very strong breakout performance for her as a candidate. But it wasn't to me it was not a clear cut. She just smacked him over the head. I mean, it was just an interesting back and forth. She made some excellent points. I thought he passionately tried to defend his record, maybe not as succinctly as he might have liked to, but just a very interesting exchange.
So one other issue that you had, and I'm trying to bring us up full, Allison, but I don't think I'm doing it correctly. Hit it here. All right. There we go. All right. So now we're up full again. No still picture of the vice president. And that was health care. Both nights, the moderators asked, do you believe in Medicare, in the Medicare for All bill, basically eliminating private health insurance? The first night, 2 raised their hand. The second night, almost all of them, I think, raised their hands. You indicated before we started this that there are 2 issues where the Democrats are going to go very far left because it's a primary: healthcare and immigration. Are these going to continue to be the 2 issues that distinguish one candidate from another as we narrow the field?
Yeah. I mean, I think we saw in 2018, right, that healthcare was the leading issue in the midterm election. It helped a lot of Democrats get elected to Congress around the country, including a couple of seats here in Texas. The problems associated with healthcare, access to care, cost of prescription drugs, all of those things still continue, right? So I don't think that issue is going away. The problem is that the solutions around it are very complicated and very expensive. And I thought particularly for Elizabeth Warren to raise her hand and say, yes, I'm for Medicare for all and getting rid of private insurance was a notable moment, because that's sort of the Bernie Sanders position historically and what he's maintained. She had not come out that firmly in that way prior to the debate the other night. She's been surging in the polls as of late. Some people think it's at Bernie Sanders' expense, so maybe she was trying to make a bigger play to go after his share of the vote, particularly since he was not on the stage with her that night. But how we approach this issue in a primary, it may be very different than the general election, because I think most Americans agree healthcare is a major problem in this country, but depending on where you are in your life, what kind of coverage you do or do not have, what needs to be fixed is very different depending on your point of view. And as a practical matter, eliminating private health insurance is likely not feasible in the near term. I think even people who want to do it will tell you it's going to take a number of years to phase something like that in.
So one of the issues, we talked to several of the candidates in the spin room afterwards on both nights and asked them if there were topics that they didn't get to discuss that they would have liked to talk about, and several of them said that there wasn't enough foreign policy in the debate. And unlike a lot of debates in the past, there was no, hey, these are the topics we're hitting.
Right.
You know, there were no ground rules. One of them was Tulsi Gabbard, who seemed to score some points late in the first debate talking about our foreign policy when it comes to the military. Is this an issue, foreign policy, you think that plays with Democrat voters, or are the issues right now the economy, healthcare, and immigration?
I think the large focus is on domestic issues. You know, we've seen potential crises come up with North Korea, now with Iran in recent days. I think if there's a crisis point, it can insert these kinds of foreign policy issues can insert themselves very quickly into the public's consciousness. But as a whole, I think most voters, most Americans are more domestically focused. You know, how to figure out how to make it in this economy, to get health insurance, to get affordable prescription drugs, to pay for college, to be able to retire at some point. You know, people can say what they will about Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy, but generally speaking, he does not seem to be inclined to get involved in foreign military entanglements. And partially because I think he senses that there's not much appetite for it among Republicans. I think that lack of appetite extends to Democrats as well.
All right. So kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, we've got, 24 candidates, 20 of them made the stage. Gabbard, who we see here, is one of the lesser known candidates, representative from Hawaii. Another one we mentioned was Julian Castro. And then, of course, there's Marianne Williamson, who has a history here in Houston, who has no real political experience, but managed to make the stage. When you have candidates like Williamson on the stage, or these lesser knowns, who tend to take time away from the candidates who seem at this point to have a legitimate chance at winning the nomination, does that dilute the process? Does it hurt the process, or does it help it in the long run?
I think it hurts it. I think it's okay early on, but at some point they've got to begin winnowing the field. You've seen for the second round of debates the qualifications in terms of support and things like that get higher, because the reality is, like, as market researchers will tell you, when you have too many options, people can't pick.
Sure.
And so you've got to get this whole field down to like probably 7 or 8 people to have a real sense for people to be able to evaluate options and make a selection. Now I think a lot of people say, well, I know Biden, I know who Bernie is, I may know who Elizabeth Warren is, now Kamala Harris, maybe a little bit Beto, a couple of others, but most of these folks they've never heard of. Sure. And most of them are going to fall by the wayside pretty quickly, I think.
Here, can I ask an
Sure.
off-camera but side comment? Something like 27 million people watched that second debate. On the flip side, while it's not great for the political end, it's certainly much more entertaining. There was a ton of people watching, perhaps because there were so many different candidates, right?
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's why I said I think it's okay early on to have a lot of, you know, we saw this in the Republican debates too. I think we had 17 at one point on the stage, somewhere around there, and
they broke it into a varsity and JV debate, right?
And eventually that the field gets winnowed down. So yeah, I mean, it's early on. People get a shot to introduce themselves, but pretty quickly, if you can't cut the mustard, it seems to me that you're going to get cut. It's like somebody was saying last night. It's like not everybody can get a rose, right? Like with the Bachelorette.
Sure.
So.
But it's a boom.
Thank you for the ABC. Yeah, and thank you for the ABC reference, by the way. So, well, and to that end, when you talk about there being all these candidates winnowing down, ultimately it's about money and momentum, right? And that's what these debates are about. As much as they are about policy, it's about one begetting the other. Momentum gets you money, money gets you momentum. Who do you think benefits the most, big name or otherwise, from the first debate, and who has some ground to make up in the second?
Yeah, so I saw an email last night that said Kamala Harris had raised $2 million in 48 hours after her performance. So she benefited big time.
Sure.
Right. I also saw a story where one of Joe Biden's big bundlers from California dropped him. after his performance during the debate. So it sort of cuts both ways, right? I thought Julian Castro probably breathed some badly needed life into his campaign. We'll see what that looks like on his finance report in a couple of weeks, but he was running on fumes, is my sense, before this debate. So hopefully, for his sake, if he wants to continue, he's been able to boost his fortunes there. I'll be curious to see what candidates like Bernie, for example, who I thought didn't make much of an impression, sounded largely like a rerun of his previous candidacy, but who still maintains a core of support. What kind of fundraising he'll have, what kind of boost he'll be looking to get, as well as some of these other folks. But the big winner, I thought, so far has been Kamala Harris in terms of boosting her fortunes, and I thought Elizabeth Warren did herself some good, probably in gaining support as well.
So is Texas in play?
Absolutely. Look at the polls we've seen over the last couple of months. Most of them show Donald Trump mired in the low 40s in terms of support. We've had three or four polls that show the race either tied or him even trailing a candidate like Joe Biden by 3 or 4 points. A lot can change between now and next November, so I don't want to say that I think that's what's necessarily going to happen, but I think we saw on the heels of the surprisingly close result in 2018 statewide that phenomenon does not seem to be going away. A lot of it's because Texas has changed a lot and continues to change rapidly. And I think you've heard folks like Senator John Cornyn say Republicans cannot take the state for granted anymore. And I think he's probably right about that.
So we're going to see a lot of these candidates making their way to Texas, not just to grab money, but like they normally do, but to grab votes. So we can expect that Houston, in particular, as the state's largest city, to play a big role in that.
Absolutely. We're a Super Tuesday state. We're early in the process. So exactly 1 month after the Iowa caucuses, we'll have Super Tuesday, and Texas is going to be a big focus point because we have a ton of delegates at stake in that process, and anybody who wants to actually get the nomination needs to do well here. So you're going to see a lot of TV ads, a lot of candidate appearances, a lot of digital ads. It'll be great for you guys in the TV business, and just a lot of activity, which I think will be good for Texas in terms of generating more national focus on our state.
Great. Keir Murray, thanks. Always good to see you.
Pleasure.
We appreciate it, and thank you for watching. Of course, you can always get more of our political coverage at abc13.com and by downloading our free news app, and pretty much during every newscast, you're going to see something about 2020.